There comes a moment in every nation's story when silence ceases to be a choice and becomes complicity. Silence at first feels safe. It shields us from controversy, it spares us from being targeted, it allows us to move quietly through the storms of cultural conflict without drawing unwanted attention. But in a society where truth itself is under attack, silence is no longer a protective covering, it becomes a weapon wielded by those who thrive on suppression. When Charlie Kirk was assassinated, it was not just his voice that was stolen, it was the voice of countless men and women who in their silence realized that their hesitation had paved the way for such a moment. His death is a stark reminder that the price of silence in a divided America is far more costly than the price of speaking the truth. Think about the psychology of silence. Silence is rarely neutral, it is charged with meaning. When you remain silent in the face of injustice, those around you interpret it as approval. When lies spread unchecked, silence grants them legitimacy. And when violence becomes the last resort of those who cannot win the argument, silence emboldens them. The culture of silence creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum steps chaos, intimidation, and tyranny. History teaches us this lesson over and over again. Tyrants do not rise because their ideas are strong. They rise because good people remain silent long enough for fear to become the new language of the land. What happened to Charlie Kirk is not an isolated act of madness. It is the natural fruit of years of silencing, mocking, and ostracizing voices that dare to challenge cultural orthodoxy. When free speech is rebranded as hate speech, when disagreement is recast as violence, and when debate is dismissed as danger, then actual violence is not far behind. His assassination should be read not merely as an attack on one man, but as an indictment of a society that has allowed silence to spread like a virus, infecting homes, churches, universities, and communities until truth itself is gasping for air. Now I want you to consider the deeper philosophical problem. Silence feels like a compromise, but it is in fact a surrender. In a democracy, silence hands over the microphone to those who shout the loudest, those who intimidate most effectively, and those who manipulate the narrative with the sharpest tools of propaganda. And the paradox is this: by saying nothing, you think you are avoiding conflict, but in reality, you are feeding the very conflict that will one day engulf you. What you will not confront today in words, you will be forced to confront tomorrow in chaos. The human heart knows this instinctively. Psychologists tell us that when people repress their convictions, when they bury what they know to be true deep inside in order to keep the peace, they do not find peace. Instead, they find anxiety, guilt, and moral fatigue. They live with the constant weight of knowing they are betraying something essential, their own conscience. And when a culture trains its people to silence their convictions, that culture creates a population filled with inner turmoil, fragile and easily manipulated, because they no longer trust their own voice. This is what we are witnessing in America today, a generation trained not to speak, not to question, not to challenge, but to remain silent in the hope of avoiding punishment. And into that silence walked the bullet that took Charlie Kirk's life. Let us not deceive ourselves. Silence is not peacekeeping. Silence is not patience. Silence is not humility. Silence in the face of lies and violence is agreement. It is the quiet nod that grants permission for evil to continue unchallenged. And yet, so many have justified their silence with noble-sounding reasons. I don't want to cause division. I don't want to lose friends. I don't want to put my job at risk. But at what point do we admit that the cost of our silence is higher than the cost of speaking? At what point do we recognize that our silence has created a culture where violence feels like an acceptable substitute for debate? You see, courage does not mean the absence of fear. Courage means speaking anyway. Courage means risking the scorn of those who despise the truth, because the alternative, the silence that leads to violence, is far worse. When Kirk stood up, he was not just defending a political ideology, he was embodying the simple conviction that truth must be spoken even when it is unpopular. His voice was strong because he refused to be silent, and that refusal made him a target. But his refusal also gave him a dignity and a power that no bullet can erase. The tragedy of his death should not drive us deeper into silence, it should drive us out of it. If we shrink back now, we are telling the world that assassination works, that violence wins, that fear rules the public square. But if we break our silence, if we speak with clarity, conviction, and compassion, then we declare that one man's death will not erase truth from the earth. We declare that intimidation may take a life, but it cannot take away a legacy. And we declare that silence will no longer be our offering to the idols of fear. What America must face is the reality that silence is not merely an individual weakness, it has become a national epidemic. It has seeped into our institutions, into our families, into our churches. Leaders hesitate to lead, teachers hesitate to teach, parents hesitate to guide. And why? Because silence has been sold to us as safety, but it is not safe, it is deadly. The bullet that ended Charlie Kirk's life did not begin in a moment of madness. It began in years of silence, where truth was left undefended and hatred was left unchecked. So here we are, faced with a choice. Will we continue to let silence speak for us, or will we reclaim our voices before more lives are lost, before more freedoms are stripped away, before more truth is assassinated? Silence may feel easier, but it is not easier in the end. It is far harder to live under the weight of regret, under the burden of compromise, under the shadow of knowing you withheld your voice when it was most needed. The time to break the silence is now. Not tomorrow, not when the climate is safer, not when the risks are fewer, now. Because every moment we wait, the cost rises higher. Kirk's assassination is proof of that. His death is a warning that silence is no longer an option, and his legacy is a challenge to us all. Will we find our voices, or will we continue to bury them in the shallow grave of fear? The final question I leave with you is this: when the history of this moment is written, will it record that you stayed silent or that you stood up? Because silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of courage. And if courage does not speak now, violence will continue to speak for us. Breaking the silence is no longer a suggestion, it is a moral necessity. The future of truth, freedom, and human dignity depends on it. When a man is silenced by violence, the world expects his influence to fade with the final breath he takes. But history reveals the opposite. The paradox of assassination is that it often amplifies the very message it seeks to destroy. We call this martyrdom, not merely in the religious sense, but in the broad human reality that when someone dies for what they believe, their life takes on a significance that can outlive their words. Charlie Kirk's assassination is not simply the extinguishing of one voice, it is the transformation of that voice into something larger than itself, something woven into the conscience of a nation struggling to decide what it will become. Think for a moment of those whose deaths have shaped history. Abraham Lincoln's assassination did not kill the dream of a unified America, it sealed it with blood. Martin Luther King Jr. As assassination did not silence the cry for civil rights, it etched it permanently into the moral foundation of this nation. Even further back, Socrates drank the hemlock not as a defeat, but as a testimony that truth cannot be destroyed by force. Violence may stop the man, but it cannot stop the movement his life represents. In the same way, Kirk's assassination has already begun to raise questions that cut deeper than political partisanship. It has forced a nation to ask, what does it mean when ideas are met not with debate, but with death? What does it say about the health of a democracy when bullets are used where words should suffice? Philosophers have long wrestled with the mystery of why martyrdom wields such power. It is because death unmasks intention. While many speak boldly when safe, only those willing to face consequence, sometimes the ultimate consequence, prove the authenticity of their convictions. A man who dies for his beliefs exposes the shallow rhetoric of those who only posture when it is convenient. In that sense, martyrdom is not chosen by the one who dies, it is conferred by the society that could not tolerate his voice. Charlie Kirk did not set out to be a martyr, but the hostility that surrounded him chose it for him. And now his death speaks in ways his speeches never could, for it reveals the cost of truth in an age that despises it. Psychologically, martyrdom ignites something primal in the human heart. We are drawn to courage. We admire those who stand when it would be easier to bow. We long for evidence that convictions are worth more than comfort. When someone gives their life in that way, even enemies are forced to pause. They may still disagree with the ideas, but they cannot escape the reality that the ideas had enough weight to command a life, and that awareness unsettles them. It plants seeds of doubt about the path of hatred, because it proves that some things are stronger than fear. But there is a darker side we must acknowledge as well. Martyrdom is not merely a symbol of courage, it is also an indictment. It accuses the culture that allowed it to happen. It exposes the moral failure of a society that replaces reason with rage and argument with assassination. Every martyr's death shines a light on the decadence of the environment that produced it. And in this way, Kirk's death is both a rallying cry for courage and a mirror showing us who we have become. It tells us that America is no longer a nation where vigorous debate is the hallmark of freedom. It has become a place where debate itself is dangerous, where to disagree is to risk destruction. That is not the sign of strength in a democracy, it is the sign of decay. The tragedy of martyrdom, however, carries with it the possibility of renewal. Death wakes the sleeping. Blood on the ground often speaks louder than the living ever could. The question is not whether Kirk's death will be remembered. It will. The question is what we will do with the memory. Will we honor it with the courage to speak, or will we bury it in platitudes and go back to the same silence that made his death possible? Consider again the paradox. Those who seek to silence a voice by killing it actually give it longevity. This is the lesson of every age. Rome thought it silenced Christians by throwing them to lions, but instead their blood became the seed of a global faith. Assassins thought they killed freedom's dreamers, but their dreams only grew stronger in the generations that followed. The same choice confronts us now. Kirk's assassination could become a footnote in history, quickly forgotten in the noise of politics. Or it could become a watershed moment, a reminder that ideas are worth defending and that freedom requires the courage to resist intimidation at every level. Martyrdom in the end is about legacy. What one man cannot finish in life, others are compelled to carry forward after his death. That is why martyrdom has always terrified tyrants. It multiplies the influence of the one they sought to silence. The question is not whether Kirk's death will matter, it already does. The question is whether it will matter enough to awaken those who have been asleep, to shake those who have been silent, and to stir those who have been content with apathy. So we must ask ourselves, will his death mark the end of a voice or the beginning of a movement? Will it drive us deeper into silence? Or will it break the chains of fear and give us the courage to speak what we know to be true? Because if martyrdom has any meaning, it is this, that truth is more powerful than the fear of losing one's life. And if his death is to mean anything, then it must not be wasted on empty mourning. It must be translated into courage, into conviction, into the refusal to allow intimidation to rule the public square. This is why martyrdom matters in Trump's America, or in any America. It confronts us with the stark reality that ideas are worth more than personal safety. It reminds us that freedom is not preserved by comfort, but by sacrifice. And it challenges each of us with a choice: will we let his death be in vain? Or will we let it be the spark that rekindles courage in a nation that has forgotten how to speak? The closing truth is simple yet piercing. Assassination may end a life, but it cannot end the truth that life carried. In fact, it only ensures that truth will echo louder, longer, and deeper than before. Kirk's death now belongs to history, but what history writes next depends on us. The silence of one man's enemies has already spoken. Now the question is whether the courage of his friends will answer. Hatred does not erupt in a single moment. It grows slowly, deliberately, and often invisibly. Assassination is not born in the instant a trigger is pulled. It is born in years of conditioning and layers of contempt, in words that strip away humanity until the act of violence seems not only possible but justified. When Charlie Kirk was assassinated, it was not simply the action of one disturbed individual. It was the culmination of a culture that had been teaching step by step that his life was expendable, his ideas intolerable, and his humanity irrelevant. If we fail to examine the psychology behind such hatred, then we will fail to recognize how dangerously close we are to repeating it. At the root of this lies a dangerous process psychologists call dehumanization. Dehumanization begins when we stop seeing our opponents as people and start viewing them as caricatures, labels, or enemies. It is easier to hate a label than a person. It is easier to destroy an enemy than a neighbor. Words become the first weapon, language that reduces individuals to stereotypes, rhetoric that paints them as existential threats rather than fellow citizens. Over time, this rhetoric hardens the conscience, and once someone is no longer seen as human, violence against them feels not like a crime but like an act of justice. History gives us chilling examples. Before the Holocaust, Jews were portrayed in propaganda as vermin, parasites, subhuman. Before the Rwandan genocide, Hutus were taught to call Tutsis cockroaches. Before every great act of collective violence, there is always a season of language designed to erase dignity and justify destruction. That same process unfolds in our time, subtly, relentlessly, through social media campaigns, political rhetoric, and cultural narratives that cast opponents not as neighbors to debate, but as enemies to eliminate. Kirk was not assassinated in a vacuum. He was assassinated in an America where contempt has become normalized and hatred has been weaponized. Now let's pause and consider why hatred is so seductive. Psychologically, hatred simplifies life. It gives us a clear enemy, a target for our frustration, a scapegoat for our failures. Hatred provides a sense of belonging. When we hate the same people, we feel united with others. And hatred gives the illusion of moral superiority. It convinces us that because our opponents are evil, everything we do against them is righteous. That's why hatred escalates so quickly. It's addictive. It feeds the ego while starving the conscience. But hatred carries within it a terrible blindness. It convinces us we are fighting for justice while making us unjust. It persuades us we are defending truth while pushing us deeper into lies. And eventually it pushes us to justify violence. The shooter who took Charlie Kirk's life was not born with that intent. He was shaped by it, shaped by narratives, by communities of outrage, by voices that taught him that Kirk was not merely wrong, but dangerous, not merely an opponent, but an obstacle to be removed. That is the psychology of hatred. It warps the mind until evil feels like duty. Philosophically, we must recognize what is at stake when hatred erases human dignity. Human dignity is not granted by political affiliation, by agreement, or by cultural approval. Human dignity is intrinsic, given by God, stamped into every soul. The moment we forget that, we lose the foundation of a just society, because if some people are less than human, then anything can be done to them. And if anything can be done to them, then violence is no longer the last resort, it becomes the first tool. This is why the erosion of human dignity is always the beginning of societal collapse. Consider what this means for our moment. When a culture begins to demonize, when it begins to encourage outrage as entertainment and contempt as virtue, it is laying the groundwork for violence. You cannot spend years mocking, vilifying, and demeaning without eventually producing the fruit of that seed. Words may seem harmless, but they are the soil from which actions grow. And when words consistently deny dignity, actions eventually follow. That is the path that led to Kirk's assassination, and it is the same path that threatens every society that refuses to arrest the spread of hatred. But here is the harder truth. Hatred thrives in silence. It grows stronger when unchallenged. And many who would never pull a trigger themselves become complicit when they allow hatred to spread unchecked in their communities, their workplaces, their families, even their churches. Indifference is the oxygen hatred needs. Each time we shrug and say, "It's just rhetoric," we fail to see the trajectory. Each time we excuse cruelty in speech, we forget that cruelty rarely stops at words. Each time we allow contempt to masquerade as passion, we are one step closer to justifying the unthinkable. The way forward requires both courage and clarity. Courage to name hatred for what it is, not just in the extremes, but in the subtle forms that creep into our own hearts. And clarity to remember that disagreement is not dehumanization, that debate is not destruction, and that freedom requires us to see our opponents not as enemies but as fellow bearers of human dignity. Breaking the cycle of hatred does not mean abandoning conviction. It means holding conviction without surrendering to contempt. It means remembering that the worth of a human soul is never up for debate, even when their ideas clash with our own. Charlie Kirk's assassination should therefore awaken us to the urgency of reclaiming this basic truth that every person, regardless of politics, race, ideology, or creed, is a human being made in the image of God. To deny that is to deny the very ground on which liberty stands. Without dignity, freedom collapses into chaos. Without dignity, democracy turns into tyranny. Without dignity, we are left with nothing but violence as the final arbiter of disputes. We must learn again how to see people, not as hashtags, not as political enemies, not as threats, but as human beings. If we cannot do that, then more lives will be lost, more voices will be silenced, and more blood will be shed. But if we can rediscover that vision, then hatred loses its grip, violence loses its appeal, and dignity reclaims its rightful place at the center of our public life. Let me leave you with this thought. Hatred always begins by erasing someone's humanity, but healing begins by restoring it. If we want to honor the life that was taken, if we want to prevent more assassinations in the future, then we must commit ourselves not only to defending truth, but to defending the dignity of those with whom we disagree. Because when dignity is defended, hatred loses its fuel. And when hatred loses its fuel, violence has no ground to stand on. The measure of a nation is not how it treats those who agree, but how it honors the humanity of those who disagree. If we forget that, we will lose more than a life, we will lose the very soul of our society. If silence is complicity, and martyrdom is the echo of courage, and hatred is the erosion of human dignity, then the only path left for us, the only path that honors the cost of Charlie Kirk's life, is to break the silence and reclaim courage in the public square. For silence has already claimed too much, and hatred has already taken too many captives. The time for retreat has passed. What remains is a choice to speak or to be spoken for, to stand or to fall, to reclaim our voices or to surrender them forever. Breaking the silence is not simply about talking louder. It is about speaking with conviction, with clarity, and with moral strength. It is not about shouting into the void of outrage, where noise drowns out meaning. It is about speaking truth with courage when the world demands your compliance. Courage in the public square does not look like arrogance. It looks like fidelity. It looks like remaining anchored to truth when every cultural current is pulling in the opposite direction. But let us not pretend this is easy. Courage comes with a price. To break the silence is to risk misunderstanding, to risk rejection, to risk losing comfort, status, or even safety. Yet history has always been advanced by those who are willing to pay that price. Societies do not change because the majority suddenly wakes up. They change because a minority has the courage to speak when everyone else remains silent. That courage becomes a spark, and the spark becomes a flame, and the flame spreads until even those who once opposed it are forced to confront the truth. Psychologically, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that fear will not have the final word. Fear thrives in silence because silence tells fear it has already won. But when one person stands and speaks, fear begins to lose its grip because courage is contagious. When you see someone willing to risk ridicule or risk rejection, something awakens inside you. You realize that you too can stand. And so courage multiplies. One voice becomes two, two become 10, 10 become thousands. This is how movements begin, not with unanimous consensus, but with one person refusing to be silent. Philosophically, courage in the public square requires us to remember the value of truth itself. If truth is negotiable, then courage has no meaning. But if truth is absolute, if it is something higher than opinion, greater than politics, deeper than cultural trends, then courage becomes not optional, but essential. Because without courage, truth remains trapped in theory. It is never lived, never embodied, never defended. Truth without courage is a caged lion. It has strength, but it is silenced. Courage opens the cage and lets it roar. And yet, courage must be paired with compassion. To break the silence is not to weaponize our words. It is to wield them wisely. It is to speak truth, not to destroy, but to illuminate. It is to confront lies not with hatred, but with love, strong enough to withstand hostility. This is the balance our moment demands: the courage to speak, and the compassion to remember that even our fiercest opponents are human beings with souls of eternal worth. Without compassion, courage becomes cruelty. Without courage, compassion becomes cowardice. Together they form the posture that can heal a broken nation. Now consider the state of our public square today. It is filled with noise but not courage. Outrage masquerades as boldness, but outrage is fragile. It burns hot and then burns out. True courage does not rage, it endures. It does not seek applause, it accepts sacrifice. It does not measure success by immediate results. It measures success by faithfulness to the truth. And that is what we need in this hour. Not louder outrage, but deeper courage. Courage that speaks even when no one is listening. Courage that stands even when standing is costly. Courage that refuses to be silenced by intimidation or erased by violence. If Charlie Kirk's life teaches us anything, it is that voices can be silenced, but legacies cannot. And if his death calls us to anything, it is to reclaim our own voices before more are lost. The question is not whether we will face opposition, The question is whether we will allow opposition to silence us, or whether we will let opposition refine us into people of greater resolve. Because the future of a free society does not depend on how safe its people feel, it depends on how courageous they are willing to be. Breaking the silence requires ordinary people to act with extraordinary conviction. It is not reserved for politicians or public figures. It belongs to every parent who teaches their children the value of truth even when the culture teaches lies. It belongs to every student who dares to ask hard questions in classrooms that demand conformity. It belongs to every worker who refuses to compromise integrity for advancement. It belongs to every citizen who understands that silence in the face of falsehood is not neutrality, it is surrender. So here we stand at a crossroads. On one side lies silence, safe, comfortable, unchallenged, but ultimately complicit. On the other side lies courage, risky, costly, uncomfortable, but the only path that leads to freedom. Each of us must choose. And the choice cannot be delayed, for silence grows heavier with time, and courage grows harder with neglect. The call is not to reckless speech, but to responsible courage. Not to endless noise, but to enduring truth. Not to winning arguments, but to witnessing with our lives that truth is worth defending, dignity is worth honoring, and freedom is worth preserving. If we do this, then Kirk's death will not have been in vain. If we do this, then hatred will not have the last word. If we do this, then silence will be broken and courage will reclaim the public square. So I ask you, what will history say of us? That we retreated into silence while violence reigned? Or that we broke the silence, spoke with courage, and stood for truth even when it cost us everything? The answer is not written yet. It is waiting in our choices, our words, our courage. Truth can be silenced by fear, but it cannot be killed. Courage is the only language that keeps it alive. Speak it, live it, defend it, for the future of our nation depends on it.